everybody. It is Steve, your friendly neighborhood lawn gnome. Welcome back to another video over here on That's Comical. And if you're watching and it happens to be a Wednesday, happy new comic book day. Andy and I are back here again for another stopping point in our ultimate journey tonight, our Marvel Ultimate Journey Road to Secret Wars 2015. Andy, it's always great to have these conversations with you, and I'm hoping that you're looking forward to this video.
Yeah, this is a particularly good one, and this is a part of the journey that I was looking forward to, if not for the implications for the broader story that we're following, simply in the fact that this is a good book, and I was looking forward to reading this one.
Yeah, and the reason why this one is so crucial is we basically take a look at what has transpired up until this point. We have seen everything from, and this is even going a little further back to our actual starting point. We saw everything from the death of Hawkeye to an alternate reality created by Wanda Maximoff, which led to the decimation of the mutant population. And so basically, the X-Men are pretty down in the dumps, and now things are just going to go from bad to worse. And what that means, we are talking about probably one of the most iconic comic book stories in Marvel in the 21st century. And that, of course, is the first, remember, because there's multiple ones, but we're talking about the good one here. We're talking about Civil War, written by one of my personal favorite writers in all of comic books, the great Mark Millar, and incredible pencil and artwork by the great Steve McNiven. So, yeah, I was really looking forward to this point because of how important this really is going to be for this particular reality of the Marvel Universe moving forward all the way to Secret Wars. But another reason why I was really excited about this was because this is pretty much going to make my claim completely stern, and I'm not going to get off of this high horse when I say, if you love Captain America Civil War, you have no idea what you're thinking about or even talking about, because when you take a look at this source material, you are going to be absolutely shocked and maybe, like me, a little pissed off seeing what was there and what it was turned into for cinematic purposes. And Andy, I'm just going to say this. After I read this book, I had already had sour feelings about Captain America Civil War, the film. And after reading this book, I truly despise that film even more.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I have a soft spot for the movie. It's not my favorite of the Marvel movies, but without going too much into it, it was one that I was able to go into thinking this is going to be inherently different from the source material. It is going to be loose inspiration for a Marvel Cinematic Universe story. And I always felt that they did a pretty good job of lifting some of the themes from this book
True.
and telling a Marvel Cinematic Universe version of it. As a beat for beat adaptation, it's a piss poor one. But as an MCU movie, I find it to be slightly above middle of the road for me. And this is from someone who likes a lot of the movies, so that it's
I'm a fan
calling it middle of
too.
the pack.
I'm a
Yeah.
fan too, but I think what really upsets me about it is because when you take a look at how incredible Captain America the Winter Soldier is, you wonder why Marvel just never wanted to go down those dark paths, because there's a very dramatic, beautiful, but extremely violent and dark story in the pages of Civil War. And what it was going to turn into in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, yes, it made a little sense, but knowing what was in the source material, knowing what more you could have done,
Yeah.
you could have created something truly spectacular and not necessarily something that had to be funny.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I get that. I also think, obviously, because of the nature of having fewer stories to tell in the medium of film than in comics, since you get your monthly issues, your multiple series, your different places where you can tell the stories. I think doing a comparatively smaller Civil War, and quite frankly, one that can be cleaned up so the heroes can be back together again faster, was probably important for the MCU version. But putting that part aside, the book on its own, talking about just the book now, um, is a great read. And
Absolutely.
Steve, I should start by saying, for doing this step of the journey, you and I read the core issues, and that's what we're here to talk about. Um, I will mention that I've read Civil War now twice, and the first time I read it, I did it with like a full reading order of like all the branded tie-in issues across all the series. And my experience with it, this is now a few years removed. I think that I might have done that like 10 years ago at this point, read those stories. um, but my experience reading just the core books straight through right now was so different,
Yeah.
it was wild to me how different it was. um, and we can talk a little bit about that as we go through, but I just kind of wanted to say that. And then maybe, Steve, if you have thoughts, this is just my chance to quick throw it out there. If any people are doing the journey with us and you're reading Civil War and you have a little bit of extra time and want to read some more stories, I would say read Frontlines as well to expand how you're looking at these stories, as well as the main series, at the very least, Amazing Spider-Man tie-in. I don't know if there's others that jump to mind for you as being particularly important, Steve, but I figured worth
Well,
flagging those.
let me just say, Andy, thank you very much for bringing that up, because that was definitely something that we also like to do when we go on our ultimate journeys. We want to let people know, if you want to go a little further down the rabbit hole, if there are other paths to take, we'd like to let you guys be aware of this. So I read Civil War for the first time a little over 5 years ago now. And I definitely knew about Civil War, that it was one of the books that I had to read when I officially got back into comics and caught up. But one of the other things that I knew about Civil War was two words: it's massive. This was a true iconic event, one that truly engulfed the entire Marvel comic world. Every title that was out there pretty much had a Civil War tie-in, and there were even other mini and maxi series that were created as tie-ins for this purpose. There's also the prologue, The Road to Civil War. There's even the one-issue epilogue, which I don't want to spoil what happens in there, but I'd love to get into that at the very, very end. So I knew going into this, I needed to figure something out, because the last thing that I wanted to do was read everything and feel unsatisfied. Because unfortunately, with Marvel, half the time you're going to feel that way, because there's a lot of tie-ins that an event in Marvel usually doesn't need. DC goes in the exact same direction too, not as many times as Marvel does. So luckily, one of the few things that helped me bounce back into comics was really getting to know a lot of people in the comic book community on YouTube. And there's a great veteran in the community called Comics Explained, and he did a 5-hour Civil War video. And what he did was, not only did he go over the core story, he specifically wanted to talk about the tie-ins that he felt moved the story forward and really were important to it. So, yes, I definitely wanted to take advantage of some of those issues, a whole mini or maxi series that was involved in it. And I will say, following his instructions, plus a couple of additional things that I was personally interested in, I felt extremely satisfied. I would definitely say that when it comes to Civil War, if you want to get into it, you should definitely read, maybe not all of, but definitely the Spider-Man Road to Civil War, because that gives you an understanding of the fact that when you immediately see Spider-Man in Civil War 1, he's wearing a brand new suit. Well, now we know where he gets this suit. As you said, Civil War Frontlines, very crucial to the story. Definitely the Amazing Spider-Man issues are very crucial to the story. I particularly was interested in the Fantastic Four tie-in, as well as the X-Men tie-in, and also a couple of one issues here and there. Like, I thought that She-Hulk #8 was definitely a very important issue to read because of the fact that it shows you the aftermath of what happens in the first issue with the heroes known as the New Warriors. We'll get into them in just a bit, as well as Wolverine's tie-in about the fact that he actually is on a mission because of what happened at the end of Civil War issue #1. So if you rope all of those together, I think you definitely get a more complete story. Whereas with this 7-issue miniseries on its own, you still get a very powerful, very dramatic, very iconic story. But I got to be honest with you, Annie, maybe you can help me here. I don't know about the actual feeling that you get or what you really feel when you've just read those 7 issues alone. Maybe it's just because of the fact that I read the tie-ins and I just felt a little unfulfilled, or just like knowing what is out there and what it becomes and what it turns the whole story into. But I would probably say that if you just read the 7 issues alone, you would probably still very much enjoy the story.
I think you would. But I do think this is the, sadly rare event where lots of the tie-ins really enrich the experience. And I know we've even talked about it on the channel some, the idea of these big events trying to make everything out as don't miss, and so much of it is tangential, unimportant, or poorly written, or differently written. I think Civil War is one of the greatest examples of an event where your experience is truly enriched by a lot of the side content. I felt that a lot of the emotional core of this story was missing in reading
Yeah.
just the main issues. And now I'm going to forget in which book it was published. I don't know if, but the Luke Cage story is the one that sits with me most prominently when I look back on Civil War, and missing that like heart really, I really felt something missing.
Is that the Heroes for Hire tie-in?
I think so. I think that's where it is.
I did read the first issue. I mean, I did
Yeah.
read a little bit of Ms. Marvel, a little bit of New Avengers, but not all of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
The
But
Thunderbolts.
I also very interesting though. And I feel like it's a trite conversation, so we don't really need to have it, but we can go into it if you want to. But in terms of who is right, um, I found it so fascinating that reading the core stories, um, I somehow felt it was much murkier and harder to say
Yeah, I
who
agree
was
with you
right.
there.
And if you read the expanded everything, I come away thinking it is absurd that anyone could disagree with Captain America. But if you just read the core stories, it is artfully put together, despite every roadblock that is thrown in our way to make you cheer against Tony, including being the one who's willing to work with villains.
Let's all be honest about Tony Stark, okay? He's a douche, but he's our douche, and we
Yeah,
love him for that.
yeah. No, but I say that just because it's so interesting that for as much as of this story made me long for the full experience,
Yeah.
there was something really unique in reading the core stories where I found myself thinking, this is less black and white doing only the core stories. In not reading, I mean, the famous scene I always think of is from an Amazing Spider-Man tie-in issue, which is Captain America talking to Peter. No, you move, like that. For me, that's Civil War, and that's not from the core
That's
books.
also true because you get these big gaps because it's like you take a look at issues 1 through 7 and you actually take a look at what happens with Peter within that story. At one point he's on one side and at one point he's on the other
Just
side.
on the other.
And the question is, when exactly does he start having second thoughts? When in fact does he switch? And why does he switch? Like, who got into his head? You don't
Yeah.
see that in the core story.
Yeah, yeah. Well, no, you move. One of my most iconic moments in comic book history. I don't know what else you wanted to talk about on this, if anything, but maybe we should zoom it into the books we actually read.
Absolutely. And I mean, I also think a big driving force of the book itself is definitely the artwork, especially when you take a look at the core story. I mean,
Yeah.
I said this to you off camera, and I don't know what your thoughts were because I don't think you actually answered the question, but it's like Steve McNiven's a great artist. And when I take a look at the work that he does in Civil War, the colors that he chooses, one of the few things I love is the color palette. It's a lot of reds, a lot of burgundies, a lot of maroons. Like you could tell that there's a sign of distress and a sign that tempers are flaring and we're like in red alert, we're DEFCON 4, like we're in serious waters here. But the details in the characters, I mean, I still love to flip the pages and see the details that he does on Captain America's costume. They're gorgeous.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if I were to really say something off color here, I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but when I read this book and I looked at this art, I said, wow, if Alex Ross actually drew in traditional comic book format, you get Steve McNiven's art. It's beautiful work.
Yeah, I understand why you like feel like that's a controversial take, but it's one I understand. I don't think it's the way that I would choose to describe the art, but I do totally get where you're coming from,
It's
particularly
very
in
smooth.
the deep detail, the precision of the scenes that are depicted. Um, Motion, yes, but a tendency towards like tableau shots. Um, yeah, it's not a bad way to describe the art we're looking at in this book. I understand what you mean. And as you're talking about it, I'm flipping through issue 7 just in front of me right now and thinking, yeah, yeah, I get what you mean. I get what you
Yeah.
mean.
I also
And it is
really
it is a beautiful book. You're right. There's so much joy to be had in just browsing this story.
Yeah, and I also really appreciate, even in this, the core 7 issues, how one of the few things I love about Mark Miller is he's so character driven along with his
Mm,
stories. He loves his stories, but he adores his characters. And one of the few things that I truly appreciate is that he always gives each individual character at least one panel to say something or have a moment, because there's a lot of characters in here. And one of the few things that you definitely see in these books is there's a lot of scenes with crowds, lots of scenes where there's a lot of well-known heroes or villains in one room, and how it's shown and how everyone can be seen. Everyone has a voice. It's brilliantly written.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, agreed completely. And that's it's we this word gets overused and probably by us too, but it's very cinematic in the way that our lens, our camera, like kind of highlights characters, gives them a moment to breathe, finds the person who has the floor in the room. Because you're right, this book is full of panels that are bursting with characters. It's part of the fun of telling a story like this. And let's, there are better comics out there, but like this one is a lot of fun and really good, and something that makes a comic really good and really fun, put a lot of heroes in it. And like, look, the cynic in me is like, that's really what they're trying to do with Civil War, put as many heroes in it as possible, make them fight, and it's like, this is super cool. But you know what, it is that, quite frankly, it is. And so getting to see that is neat for the comic fan and all of us.
All right, so Captain America Civil War fans, buckle up. You're in for one heck of a ride. So the actual original story of Civil War begins in one of the most horrific ways you could possibly imagine. And it features heroes I had not heard from in a very, very long time. Like, I could not recall the last time the New Warriors ever popped into my head in
Mhm,
Marvel since I was like 9 or 10 years old.
mhm.
And it was weird to even see that these guys were actually the hosts of a reality television show. And I was like, oh, how the mighty have fallen. And it's definitely one bizarre reality show because basically the new Warriors are scoping out a house in suburban Connecticut where a couple of villains are hiding out. And on live television in front of an audience, they're going to take these guys down. And a fight ensues. Of course, headlined on the New Warrior side by Speedball, a name that I hadn't heard of in such a long time. And they come across one of the villains named Nitro, and Nitro basically decides, you know what, I don't have time for this. And he just uses his powers to create a massive explosion just to, if anything, conclude the fight and get the cameras turned off. The result of that explosion is not one for the meek or the soft hearted, because in the midst of this explosion, people die. Not superheroes, people, humans. And some of those humans happen to be across the street in an elementary school. So children are killed. And the minute I read that, I was like, God damn you, cinematic universe! You really don't know what you're doing. that's just me. I'm like, I was shocked from the get go, and I was like, okay, I'm so excited to dive more further into this book. And so we fast forward right to the cleanup, and you see famous faces. You see Iron Man, you see Captain America, you see Wolverine, you see Daredevil. All these heroes are here, but there are also a couple of bystanders over there that aren't really looking too fondly on these superheroes. One of them happens to be a woman whose son was killed, and she goes right up to Tony Stark and spits in his face. And I'm like, wow, things are about to get real. Fast forward to next couple panels over, we see Johnny Storm, the Human Torch, going to a club with a hot date, and a bunch of people outside the club basically start calling him a baby killer. And he basically jumps his defense. He goes, hey, I wasn't even there. I know what happened, and it's terrible. And then a superhero, the Human Torch, gets beaten to the point where he has to be admitted to the hospital. So you read those things alone, and this is a sad time for the heroes. I mean, if you think the X-Men were having a tough time, this is not a good thing. And basically, the government decides enough is enough. Masked people cannot be running all over the country or even the world willy-nilly doing good things, even though it is saving people's lives, because while they're saving lives, unfortunately, some of the foes that they're facing, they're causing some serious damage. So the government decides to enforce the Superhero Registration Act, in which all heroes have to unmask, tell people who they are, so the government knows that if they step out of line or if they go rogue, they're going to have to unfortunately face the consequences of the United States government. And that's when the Civil War starts to a certain degree, because Iron Man is all in, Captain America is not. Both of them have good reasons as to why, but agreeing to disagree in a case like this is not going to fly.
Yeah. And I think I have a lot to say about how it's put together. I think starting with the New Warriors is a great idea because so much of the heart of why the story is putting forward that the Registration Act is needed has to do with inexperienced heroes specifically. And so when we frame it that way and we show, hey, here's when people who are getting in over their heads with no guidance are doing something literally for the likes, can go and get people killed. It frames it really sympathetically to Tony's argument of the Registration Act being warranted, because not everybody is Captain America. And Captain America might believe that anybody can be Captain America. But the pragmatist in Tony is, we just saw what happened. If there were oversight, these guys never would have been the ones sent to deal with this. We wouldn't be in this mess. And it lands. That's that makes sense. Um, Obviously, we then get to Captain America's argument of, if suddenly, if you put it in charge of the government, they're the ones who are defining who an enemy is, and it becomes very messy. So there's a lot of sympathy there. But again, in the core stories, which is what we're talking about, I really think they do a very good job of making it more than black and white, and showing the costs and the benefits of both perspectives in the argument. And then I think it's right to point out what happens to Johnny Storm, in that it's brutal. He's a hero who gets hospitalized because regular people attack him. It shows what's at stake for the heroes if they don't go with public opinion. That people will rise up against them, and the good in them will prevent them from fighting back at full force.
But sometimes Johnny does deserve to get punched in the face.
Look, Johnny Storm might deserve to get punched in the face occasionally. Yes, yeah, but anyway, so we talk about, this is the first time we've heard from some of these folks, like in the New Heroes, New Warriors, and some of the lesser villains that they're up against, who they're just trying to bring in. But I think that's with really good purpose here, and I think really sets up the story for success throughout the rest of the way.
Yeah, and I mean, like, Captain America, you could definitely feel where he is, because he is just like, a hero is a hero, and at the end of the day, they're doing what is right. But Tony is basically like, yes, Cap, I agree with you, but as long as they know who's doing what they're supposed to be doing, they're not going to bother you, So I don't know whether it's just Tony wanting the fame and the glory, because, I mean, he was the guy that literally saved a whole bunch of people and then took his mask off and said, "I am Iron Man." Like, he wanted to be known right away. But and that's in the comics and the movies, by the way. I just wanted everybody to know that he is definitely not unknown. But it's also really strange to actually see that when this first battle is fought, so to speak, how the first thing that Captain America immediately does is he goes into hiding, and he already starts to try and build a resistance. And at the same time, one of the most interesting things that does take place is Spider-Man has a press conference, and he's the first superhero to take his mask off and reveal to the world that he's been Spider-Man for 15 years. And of course,
and J. Jonah Jameson.
The icing on the cake is how all of a sudden J. Jonah Jameson is not in the room.
J. Jonah Jameson.
That was probably the best part about that. But it's also really crazy to see how ageless the world of comics is, because 15 years, it's definitely been more than 15 years since Spider-Man was written in the pages of Marvel Comics, but still.
Yeah. And of course, the unveiling of Spider-Man, the revelation of that identity is heart to Civil War, and emblematic of, if he can do it, so can you. The characters make it pretty explicit in the way they talk in the story about how no one kept their secret identity more protected than Spider-Man. That's probably true. And it's also probably something that comic fans kind of by osmosis know, regardless of how much or how little you have engaged with comics when you turn the Civil War. So it's certainly a huge moment, and hilarious for us getting to see J. Jonah Jameson's version of it. But yeah.
I think probably another one of the saddest parts of Civil War, and that's one of the main reasons why I did venture down into one of the tie-ins, how this event tears the Fantastic Four apart.
Yeah.
Because Reed, and no offense to Reed, I expect him to go on to the side of Tony, because that's basically what it is. It's Team Iron Man and it's Team Captain America. There was no doubt in my mind that Reed was not going to side with Tony, because it's Reed Richards, the smartest man alive, a true voice of analytics and reason, the one who would even know how to hunt rogue heroes and imprison those said heroes. And Sue is absolutely stunned about the fact that he has chosen to go in this direction, especially with what happened to his brother-in-law.
Mm-hmm.
And the Thing is torn because he doesn't know what direction to take it. And I love the Fantastic Four, so that was a part of the story that really hit home for me. And by reading the Fantastic Four issues that tie into Civil War, adds a little bit more of that story to the flavor of Civil War as a whole. And it is very interesting to see, because when you're reading those issues, you're wondering, is the Fantastic Four actually going to get back together, or are Reed and Sue going to get divorced? You know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. And if we want to talk about an emotional core of it, that, I started this by saying felt lacking to me and not reading all the tie-ins. One place where you will find that emotional core to the story is within the Fantastic Four moments. You're right. And Sue's choice to leave in particular is a very impactful moment, and to see Thing, like, I wouldn't say tears in his eyes, but to the gravity that is clearly on him of seeing this group crumble apart before his very eyes, um, is very impactful to a longtime comic reader for sure.
Yeah. And as someone who doesn't really have that many Fantastic Four issues in his collection, like, these are some really, well, now I do have plenty thanks to this road that we took, because we are going to be getting into Hickman's Fantastic Four at some point. But no, I didn't have that many Fantastic Four comics up until this point. So reading these were very powerful issues. And as we go into the further issues, we see the recruitment and how these heroes get recruited to both sides. And I think what's very interesting is, I think it's easier for Captain America to do it than it is for Iron Man to do it, because I think that Iron Man is really trying to play politics with all of this, because he's pretty much trying to be on the side of the government. I think that one of the most interesting parts is when he actually goes to Westchester and he sits down with Scott and Emma, and he asks them, "Will you join our cause?" And Emma basically says, "Hey, we understand what's going on, but unfortunately, we've got our own problems to deal with right now, so we cannot help you."
Yeah, it's funny, I'm glad we're getting to the X-Men a little bit, because there is part of me that you read this story and it's like, oh, the registration, all this. Of course, in the context of what we have just read of our X-Men stories, the idea of, we're not going to sacrifice our freedoms for this is so absurd based on what the X-Men are currently facing.
He literally says we are literally prisoners in our own home right now.
We're prisoners in our own home. And Wolverine, his perspective on all of this is like, oh Lord. But no, it borders on funny, really. Just with everything the X-Men have just gone through and the way they are being imprisoned. And now the heroes are like, we don't want to report to the government. And they're like, well, you wouldn't be in a house arrest, is what the X-Men are saying. Um, but yeah, and so to kind of tie it in about the search of who will go with who and why, I think that was an important scene for us to understand why the X-Men are lesser involved here, and also an important scene for us to understand why tensions will continue to rise with the X-Men, so that we don't have the stories that we just read and the 198 kind of falling into the background too much. That we continue to exist in, as the Ultimate Journey is showing, exist in the world of all that came before. So this is, one of those moments where we continue to see elements of our journey popping up in these otherwise isolated stories.
And we even see things taking place, like heroes being approached that didn't even think that they would even be approached, because they really weren't thinking that they were as worthy. Like, even going back to House of M, who gets tapped in this whole battle? Ms. Marvel and Wonder Man, of all people, get tapped to be a part of this cause. And we even see characters, unfortunately, this is actually in the tie-ins, which is why the tie-ins are so important. We even see heroes decide that they don't even want to be heroes anymore because they just don't want to deal with all this, like Firestar. That was a very it was a very small piece of the story, but the fact that a well-known heroine, I mean, like, if you don't know who Firestar is out there, guys, I don't blame you, but Firestar is someone that I've known about for years, going all the way back to Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, the 83 cartoon. But she was also one of the New Warriors at one point in time, and she just decides, you know what, I'm just not going to be a hero anymore because I just don't want to get involved at all. So it's
Hmm.
amazing how people will take sides, people will choose which side they want. Some people will be very much conflicted as to whether or not they even think it's worth being a hero, even if they have power.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
And so issue 3 features the actual first physical battle between the sides, and it's very powerful. It's also really sad to actually watch in this issue Captain America pretty much defeated.
Hmm.
And the artwork just speaks volumes. Like watching his costume literally get torn to shreds, and like how Iron Man basically says, "Just give it up, Steve. I know every single move you're about to make." Like
Hmm.
it's a very heavy hitting issue, and yet we know that it's still far from over. Captain America at the end refuses to still go down and get taken by Shield. And let me tell you something. She may not have powers, but man, does Maria Hill have some true power with Shield in regards to trying to take down some of these heroes.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
after that first battle, they're getting to the point where they're willing to go down paths that even some of the people on the side of the government are even thinking is not a good idea. And that last panel, I think it's in issue number 4, where you see some of the most well-known villains basically, yeah, we're going to pay these guys to help us. And there are people in the background that are saying, are you out of your mind? You really think these guys are going to listen to us? And you see Venom, you see Bullseye, you see Lady Deathstrike, you see some very powerful villainous threats from the Marvel Universe actually being told, we need your help. That that's scary.
Yeah, yeah. And this is all, of course, what we're talking about now follows that fight, which, includes some pretty significant moments. Not that we need to focus on deaths as much in in our Secret Wars journey.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
but yeah, and also our quote unquote Thor
Oh yeah,
coming
I
in.
completely forgot about that.
Yeah, which is important in the context of these issues. But big moments nonetheless, and a dirty fight from Tony too. One of the moments that really could get us cheering against him, even within just the core.
That's
Um,
right, because I completely forgot we actually see the death of a hero.
as I was saying before, like in reading everything, it seems like the story is let's go Captain America. But in the core stories, being more black and white, this is definitely one of the lowest moments for Tony.
Yeah, and I mean it's just like Goliath is a character
And
that
signing up with the villains too,
yeah, I mean
which you already mentioned, but
yeah, I mean Goliath is a character that unless you pay attention in Ant-Man, the film, you know who Goliath is. But yeah, it was really, really sad to see an actual death of a hero. I think that the one point where there actually was a little bit of humor was when they were actually having a funeral for him, and they said they couldn't just try and wait till he officially deactivated his powers
yeah,
because they had to literally fill like a football stadium to bury him.
yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah, you're absolutely right.
which
It's a
was
low
a fun,
blow.
a comparatively funny visual to add some levity to the moment, I guess. But and gave Tony the opportunity to say he paid for all the plots, so he, you know,
Yeah, I mean, even though we do see a lot of death in regards to Marvel, it's just like I was not I didn't expect them to actually kill off a well-known hero
yeah,
in this
yeah,
story.
yeah,
But yeah, you're right. It's very unfortunate, and like you said, it's a very it's a very low move by Tony. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and definitely kind of like I said, his lowest moment in the story, particularly the ending, because you're right, I'm flipping through as we're talking. It is the end of issue 4 where we have that shot of the villains for hire, which raises questions about
Yeah,
the ends
because
justifying the
and
means.
and and those questions are answered pretty much in the next issue because we see what the villains are really after. They're not following the rules at all. And of course, who unfortunately gets caught in the crossfire when it comes to the villains working for the government? Spider-Man.
Yep.
We've talked about Spider-Man in so many videos. We did a whole video about Spider-Man and how he always seems to be the one hero that gets the most beat up. He almost always walks away from a massive fight with a broken rib or two. But oh my God, that fight in the sewers between him, Jester, and Jack o' Lantern, these guys are not here to hunt him because, as far as I'm concerned, I think, is Peter even on Captain America's side yet in that issue?
Yeah, no. I mean, it's just I don't think he is at that point. This is clearly just vendetta against Spider-Man. And he does, I'm as I'm flipping through, Tony is there to like reel in Spider-Man, talk to him, but in terms of officially having joined Captain America, I'm not sure. But it goes to show this was never about, for the villains, this was never about finding some kind of redemption or being willing to play ball. It's like, no, you're going to let us out so we can beat up Spider-Man. Okay, we're on it. Like,
Yeah, and I think that that is one of the few points where Spider-Man is finally starting to get a little bit of a reality check and say, maybe I'm on the wrong side because seriously, why are you letting villains, let alone villains who want to kill me, why are you letting them fight with us? You really believe that these guys are going to follow the rules? And of course, we're going to see this later on, but thank goodness the Punisher decides to show up. I have not read Punisher comics. I have not. I mean, I know who he is. I know Frank Castle's story. I know that he is so beloved by so many people. But what's so amazing about him is just like he knows how to show up at the exact moment where he needs to be there.
yeah. And obviously there is in this, there's a parallel there, the pushback that is received in Captain America's team
Exactly.
to being willing to work with the Punisher, that there is on Tony's side, being willing to work with these straight up villains. There's, I think, a whole lot more of the kind of anti-hero at least aligning with goals, if not the same means kind of thing to justify. Also, it did help that he saved Peter. It's not for nothing. But there is like an equivalency being created in the comic here for sure.
Yeah, because I still remember that there was a scene where I think it was in either I think it was in issue 6 where they were fighting a couple of other villains and Punisher just shoots them,
Yeah,
kills them. And
yeah,
Captain America was like, "What the hell are you doing?" He's like, "They were bad guys."
yeah.
Like you because that's the thing. Captain America doesn't kill. Frank Castle kills. Everybody knows that. But he's never going to go out there and kill heroes. But still, this is Captain America. You got to watch yourself because you don't mess with the Boy Scout. You're going to get the horns if you mess with this Boy Scout because
Mm-hmm.
he doesn't want to feel like he is lower than the other side. And he doesn't like the idea that he actually has a guy who's willing to kill on his side, even though I will still say Punisher's intentions are not for nothing. He's
Mm-hmm.
trying to save the people he's working with. He's trying to protect others. He's trying to make sure that innocent lives are not taken. But he's going in the worst possible way of doing it because that's just his style. That's just his nature.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I did flip through, that is the next issue. So we have that I'm not going to call it honeymoon period with Punisher, but we have that brief piece in having him along before that happens and Captain America beats up on him, but then Punisher refuses to fight back because there is a code there, right? And that's what people still like about the character.
Yep.
despite all of his negative features.
Yep. And then I think the big thing is when some of the heroes on Captain America's side actually do find out what is actually happening to the heroes that they're capturing. And it's, I think, a little bit worse than actually just hiring villains to do their dirty work. They're actually banishing these heroes to a prison in the negative zone.
Right.
And that's unfortunately Reed's doing because he knows all about the negative zone. But thanks to Daredevil and a couple of other heroes, they basically try and sneak on in, and they do, towards the very end of the story, the ultimate prison bust. And then it is the showdown between Team Captain America and Team Iron Man one more time. And that is probably the most important part of the story for me, because in the heat of the moment, Captain America actually takes the opportunity, finds a way to get a moment of air, and he has a moment of clarity because he looks around and he's looking at what's happening. New York City is getting destroyed, but it's not getting destroyed because there is a threat against humanity. The threat is heroes fighting against each other for this cause. And what are they doing? Everything that the Superhero Registration Act was put into place for, to keep the heroes in check, to tell them, we understand your mission, but this is not what you should be trying to do. And Captain America is like, oh my God, I see it now. And he tells everybody to stand down. The fight is over, and he asks to be taken in.
Yeah. Here's the part where I'll say, I mean, I do find some fault here in the story. Just, you know, this is now broader than our journey or like tie-ins or all that, but I completely understand his horror that this is a created struggle causing all of this destruction between heroes, not even with villains. And I even go as far as to understand the no, they can't arrest Captain America, but they can arrest Steve. Like ending it on his terms like that to lower the temperature, right? I can also understand that. I don't love that then we all come together around the registration act is what that then means. I do find
Yeah, and
some
on top of that, Tony becomes the head of S.H.I.E.L.D.
yeah, I find some tonal dissonance there, and again I do think it's exacerbated by having, you know, experience of all the tie-ins, even though I think it's a much more morally gray story in these core issues. I still can't bring myself to think that that was the right thing to do. Nevertheless, I think it was crafted well enough that if you're going to put that forward as your thesis, at least you made the most compelling argument you could. I disagree with it, but at least thought was put into it. That's really where I'm coming from, because you can really see how much it impacts Steve
Right.
when you see like what's the line is, you know, we're winning everything except the argument. And I thought that's clever wording. I like that. I'm not sure if I agree, but it brings a certain kind of resolution to the story that
Yeah.
I don't hate. I just disagree with.
Yeah, and if it's only the 7 issues that you read in the core story, the ending is definitely one that is sort of thought provoking, I guess you might say, because the end of the story is Tony meets with the woman whose son got killed in the beginning, who's the woman who spit in his face, basically seeing what is happening now, saying that things really seem to be going in the right direction. And he basically says, maybe they are, but let's just take it one day at a time. Let's just see where we go from here. The future is still being written, and that's where we leave it. So it's sort of like, because of the fact that the side of the Registration Act won, people are starting to put their faith into superheroes again, which is pretty much what Tony wants. He wants the superheroes to continue doing what they're doing, even if it means they have to now be on leashes by the government.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is interesting to me, and that's something that I think the movie does better than the comics. To take it back to that a little bit, is I feel like we put a whole lot more on the understanding that Tony is on the side of the Registration Act as a means of assuaging his guilt. In the comic, it comes across much more like this is the responsible thing to do, will be better. In the movie, I think they do a much better job of having him be rattled by the events in such a, particularly because the events in the comics are ones that he was personally involved in. So the stakes are a little bit more, even if it's a stranger event to cause a global like panic over heroes, in my opinion, at the very least, Tony was directly involved in it. And so something that I think the movie really has going for it is you would never have Tony take over Shield at the end of the version of this that happens in the movie, because Tony wants to give up responsibility. He wants to be a sword. He doesn't want to be the hand that's wielding it. He doesn't want to be the head that's making the decision. He wants to abdicate responsibility in the movie version of this story, which I think is an interesting layer there and adds color to my reading of the comic book, which is what makes it so good and elevates it a little bit. But it does make the ending a little strange then in the context of me thinking about it in this way, because Tony's like, ah, yes, I have control. And I'm like, that's not the interesting version of this story. But nevertheless, I digress.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and then if you actually get the opportunity to read the epilogue, something really crazy happens at the end of that. We actually get the death of Captain America.
Yeah.
Which is definitely a much better way to put a pin in it, I guess you could say. I mean, the death is so anticlimactic, though, but at the end of the day, he's dead. But I will say what I think is more interesting is I think it's in that exact same issue where he has that fight with that one person, and she basically says, like, what are you really fighting for now? The America that you thought you knew is not the America that lives today. So why are you still fighting the way you've been fighting all this time? It's time for you to make some changes.
Yeah. Yeah. No, so it's a tough, it's it's where things start to get a little rocky for me. I still love this. I still think that this is a great read and worth reading, and obviously we're doing it on our journey. This is part of that kind of like murky messaging difficulty with resolution that makes it difficult for me to sit here and be like, ah, yes, one of the best comic stories ever told. It's, that's where I'm coming from.
Right. So I think that that's going to conclude this chapter of the Ultimate Journey. I really hope you all enjoyed it. I mean, I personally cannot recommend Civil War enough.
Yeah.
It's such a wonderful book, and all the tie-ins, take them as your own pace, take a look at what's out there, see what might be interesting to you, and go from there. So, of course, our next Ultimate Journey video, we're going to be going back onto the road to Blackest Night, but I just want to let everybody know that as far as Marvel's concerned, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're actually going to be taking a pause in the world of Marvel because we have to go into a bit of a segue, because you'll understand when we get to the end of this Ultimate Journey in Marvel, but we're going to go a little bit further back in time to the early 2000s, because this is the mid 2000s now. And we're going to take a look at the original Marvel Ultimate Universe that was that was headlined by Brian Michael Bendis. We also saw some other great names like Mark Miller and Warren Ellis get involved with this universe. But this was going to be a whole new Marvel universe that is 100% new and fresh for a whole new generation of readers. It's vast. There's lots in there. But once again, we're only going to be taking a look at what is essential for the road to Secret Wars. But we promise you that you will not be disappointed. So in the meantime, everybody, leave a comment in the box below. Let us know your thoughts on Civil War if you've read it. If there's anything that you want to say, let us know. We'd love to have a conversation. Hit that notification bell and subscribe to our channel so you're up to date with all of our latest episodes. And we'll see you in the next one.